Welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Ramita Iyer, Research Analyst at the Institute. On 2nd April, India and Australia signed an economic cooperation and trade agreement in a virtual ceremony. This marks the first agreement India has signed with a developed country in more than a decade. The deal will see 96% of Indian goods enter Australia duty free and will remove tariffs on more than 85% of Australian goods exports to India. The India-Australia FTA is expected to almost double bilateral annual trade in the next 5 years and is hence seen as a major milestone in deepening bilateral cooperation. To discuss the agreement itself, as well as other related aspects, I am joined by Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead Trade and Economics at ISAS. Welcome again to South Asia Chat, Dr. Palit.
Thank you, Ramita. Thank you so much. A pleasure being with you again.
To start off, I'd like to contextualize the agreement. Could you shed some light on the trends in India Australia bilateral trade, the key sectors involved, and their importance?
Well, thank you, Ramita. Firstly, I think it's important to note that the India-Australia trade relationship has, to my mind, in terms of the numbers that we see around the relationship right now, these numbers are obviously not as large as either country would expect them to be in a relative sense. So, there's a bilateral trade of around 25 billion Australian dollars, the way one can look at the number, the goods and services trade put together. Now, this is a number which clearly has the potential to go up a lot in the years to come, and following the fact that both countries will offer preferential access to each other's products and services from now on. As far as the existing trade and its character is concerned, the trade is primarily focused around energy products and minerals, and I would single out coal as one product, bituminous coal, which is Australia's largest export to India. And on the other hand, refined petroleum products happen to be a major export from India into Australia. So, in a sense, it's a mineral fuel energy products based trade relationship that we are essentially getting to see right now. But beyond the numbers, there's a story which is interesting to be looked into, and that is basically in terms of the movement of people that has been happening between India and Australia in recent times. And this would come under the category that we define as trade in services. So, which will essentially pertain to movement of people from one country to another. And as we know, over the last 10 to 12 years in particular, Australia has become a very important destination for Indian students moving outward. And that, along with the fact that there has been a fairly sizable professional migration as well, has led to a situation where Australia now has one of the largest growing and expanding Indian diasporas in the world. So, what I mean to say is that what the numbers reveal in terms of the trade relationship might actually not present the whole context and character of the trade relationship. There are elements to it which are fairly substantial, but which are not probably entirely captured by the trade statistics that we get to see.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi called the signing of the recent FTA as a watershed moment in bilateral relations. Can you tell us more about why the deal is so significant and what are the benefits in it for both India and Australia?
I think it is historic or watershed or very significant, depending upon whichever adjective you choose to define it, for a number of reasons. The first is, I think, the India Australia relationship has really scaled new heights within a short period of time. Even when we go back 10 years down the line, the India Australia relations were there. I mean, both countries were aware of each other's existence. There were movements that were happening between each other, but it wasn't in any way a relationship that one could compare to the kind of relationship that India might have with a country like United Kingdom, for example, or countries in Europe. or let's say Singapore in Southeast Asia, or not even anywhere remotely close to what India had with Japan. So, from that perspective, today, when one looks at the India Australia relationship, it's very clearly understood that both countries have come a very, very long way within a very short period of time. And I would particularly narrow down this period to the last 4 years, during which there has been a remarkable boost and expansion in the relationship. So much so that in 2020, in the middle of 2020, this was around 3 to 4 months after the COVID broke out, both countries decided to upgrade their relationship to that of comprehensive strategic partnership. And once that happened, there were a number of areas which became clearly identified between the two countries as areas of cooperation. And let's also recall that this comprehensive strategic partnership announcement came at a time when India and Australia were not discussing a free trade agreement. Their talks were suspended at the time. So, about a year after this announcement, in September 2021, both countries decided to commence, or rather recommence talks on the stalled free trade agreement. And coming from there, we have seen the conclusion of an economic cooperation and trade agreement. It's an interim trade agreement. There will be more that will be announced to this in the years that would follow. But even within that period of time, just 6 months, the conclusion of a trade agreement is actually historic. And I think by that yardstick, one can definitely call this historic. One can definitely call it a major achievement. And this is a milestone insofar as the number of goals that the India-Australia relationship aims to accomplish, and out of which there are other areas where the countries have already started begun working together. This is, say, for example, in the area of critical minerals, or in the area of safeguarding supply chains, or in the area of greater security provision in the area of Indo-Pacific. So I think the FTA is really, in that sense, a signature achievement which both countries would like to showcase very prominently in terms of a goal that has been achieved, which is going to give businesses, industries, students, and a large number of connected stakeholders in both countries much better preferential treatment to each other. And I think finally, it is all the more historic because India and Australia have never been on a, to use a cricketing terminology, on a good wicket as far as trade talks are concerned. They began talking trade in 2010. They proceeded on talks for some time, but they had to hold back talks because there were irreconcilable differences that arose during the talks. So, given that history, it's all the more sweet and charming to discover that disturbing history has not in any way hindered the progress towards the current FTA. And within 6 months, they have been able to accomplish a major goal. And hopefully, going ahead, there will be more elements that would get added to the current FTA.
Right. So now India has signed a host of FTAs with other countries as well over the years. This includes Japan, Korea, Singapore, the ASEAN grouping, and most recently the UAE. A general issue that has emerged with the existing FTAs has been that imports have usually been higher than the exports. Given this, how do you see this particular agreement panning out, and are there any other challenges that you foresee?
Thank you, Ramita, for asking that. I think that's a very valid question, and I think that is a concern that remains quite prominent with respect to a large number of India's existing FTAs, as you rightly mentioned. These include the FTAs that India has signed with Southeast Asia, with Japan, with Korea. And if one looks at the current trade relations between India and Australia in goods trade, much as the volume of trade is not as large as it could be compared with other countries, it is clear that in the India Australia trade relation as well, India is a deficit partner insofar as the amount of goods being exported by India vis a vis the amount of goods imported by India is concerned. Now, if the deficit had been the overriding factor in choosing a trade partner, then obviously India could not have gone ahead with the Australian FTAs. So it shows that that eventually has not been a consideration. But the fact of the matter is that this is where probably the Indian exporters and the Indian investors will need to sit up and take notice of the fact that this could be a FTA which offers them a considerable amount of opportunities. And it is good to make use of those opportunities because Australia has been a welcoming country. Australia has reached out to India with a large number of gestures indicating that it is open to doing constructive business and a flourishing trade relationship with India. Most importantly, given the current geopolitical conditions, the way we see the Indo Pacific surrounded by this particular geopolitics, Australia is clearly looking to diversify away from China. And China has been Australia's largest market for its exports, and similarly, Australia's largest importer has also been China. So it is an important occasion for India to actually step into the opportunity that has been created because clearly Indian products are welcome. Indian exports would be welcome. Indian investments will be welcome. Now, the extent by which this opportunity can be exploited by Indian businesses is, of course, a different story. But I think the important point to be noted over here is that I see that there are elements within this FTA, in the ECTA that has been signed till now, which are interesting and progressive. Like, say, for example, there is an effort to recognize the standards and mutual qualifications of both sides that should enable easier flow of investments from the Indian side into Australia because when Indian industries look at Australia as a prospective market for investments, they will not be constrained by the fact that if they are wanting to move people along with those investments, their people will not get affected by an issue with respect to conformity of standards or lack of recognition of qualifications. That makes the whole understanding and scenario much easier. There are already Indian industries, the Adanis and the Tatas, which have reflected considerable amount of interest in Australia. They are working there, and one would hope that as these investments grow following the FTA, more investments will flourish, not just from the Indian side, but even from the Australian side. And the other last point that I want to make, Ramita, in this regard is that sometimes we probably make a mistake in looking at an FTA purely as a bilateral trade relationship between two countries, and that's why the issue of deficit becomes important. But there could well be a scenario when Australian investments into India, for example, create facilities which enable exports from that facility to other third country markets. So, what that would mean is that perhaps those exports will not get reflected in the India Australia trade relationship, but nonetheless, it would lead to an increase in exports from India you know so I think it's also important to look at the relationship in this regard, and this is where we come into the whole question of supply chains and how they connect to the greater relationship between two countries. So I would assume that this FTA has come at a time when India has taken stock of its perspective towards FTAs. It has taken stock of the concerns that it has with respect to FTAs. We know the concerns that made India come out of the RCEP, and Australia was also a member of the RCEP. So I think both countries understand these particular concerns on part of each other. And if India has gone ahead with the FTA, then obviously the deficit has not turned out to be a prohibitive factor.
Thank you so much for that. So, I want to focus on one aspect that you mentioned earlier, which is on the stalled agreements in the past. So, we see that the initial negotiations for an FTA between India and Australia actually began more than a decade ago. Can you tell us more about the reasons behind which the deal was stalled, and how did the countries arrive at a successful agreement now?
Yeah, thank you, Ramita. Again, I think when India and Australia suspended their trade conversations in 2015, after 5 years of talking on the subject, it was mostly a result of the fact that on both sides, as I was mentioning, there were issues that were discovered where neither country was willing to offer as much market access as the other country was demanding. So, let's say, for example, when it came to India's case, Australia wanted greater market access into India for its agricultural product exports. Now, agricultural product exports include a large number of things, and these even include items like the dairy products, for example, or fruits, vegetables, cereals, meat, fish, seafood, and so on and so forth. Even wines, if one looks at beverages. On the other side, India wanted the main demand on which it had sort of got into a issue over the negotiations was that it wanted easier visas for its professionals, for its students, for its workers into Australia. Now, there were two concerns, I think, and both the concerns converged in that regard. The first is that from an India side, relaxing protections on its agricultural market was a very politically sensitive subject. And we have seen this issue panning out again and again in India's trade negotiations, including the time when India backed out of RC. There was this concern that India was not willing to offer market access beyond a particular threshold limit on agricultural exports. Similarly, on Australia's side, the entire question of allowing greater entry to Indian workers, students, or generally applicants from India was a sensitive issue as far as the domestic labor market was concerned. So I think both countries could not move forward from there and they stopped talking at that point in time. And perhaps the decision that was taken at that point in time, though it has not been officially declared anywhere, is that since both countries were involved in the RCEP talks at that stage, there was perhaps an expectation that the RCEP could, in a sense, bring both countries together into a trade template and a framework which would help them in tiding over a large number of the bilateral areas that they were otherwise discussing. That didn't happen, as we subsequently saw. But when the two countries came back to the negotiating table again, I think the biggest change in the conditions surrounding them was the fact that now India and Australia were negotiating with each other as confident countries, confident in each other. By the time they came back to the negotiating table, they had gathered a very big amount of trust in each other. And they realize that today they're in a position to actually talk between themselves on subjects which might be difficult, but they have come that much of a way in their relationship which would enable them to really constructively look at solutions which can overcome these issues. And none of the problems are really big enough to stop them from arriving at a trade agreement. So let's say, for example, if we look at agriculture, I mean, there are agricultural products which have been allowed market access by India. So, for example, fruits, vegetables, cherries, nuts, avocados, fruits, and a large number of Australian products. Let's say, for example, seafood, wool, wines are going to get deeper preferential access into the Indian market. Dairy products, of course, have not been included. But on the other hand, if we look at the concessions which Australia has offered to India, quite significant in so far as the STEM product category is concerned, the science, technology, engineering, management, where Indian students and youth are going to get not just the opportunity of traveling to Australia and studying there, but also getting the opportunity to contribute to the domestic workforce development over there. And simultaneously, the point, Ramita, that I alluded to earlier, the recognition of standards, the recognition of licensing processes, mutual qualifications, these would go a long way in facilitating people to people connectivity between the two countries. And to that extent, it's really going to make a difference. I would personally look at the India Australia trade relationship to essentially stay much more focused in the future on the trade and services area. And the trade and services area is actually the way to go for the future for both countries. I mean, this is not to say that manufacturing trade will not flourish between the two countries, but the possibilities of bilateral trade and services are enormous, including in areas like clean tech, fintech, for example, education technology, technical training, skill provision. I mean, these are the areas where really the India-Australia relationship can go a long way. And I think for both India as well as for Australia, it's important to look at each relationship distinctly. Each relationship has certain amount of pluses to come out from it, not comparable to a number of other relationships that these countries have.
Finally, I'd like to focus on another important aspect of the deal. So, while the agreement is set to bolster trade ties between the two countries, it will also deepen strategic cooperation between India and Australia, complementing their efforts in other major initiatives such as the Quad and the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. Importantly, there is a view that the deal has come together since Quad partners aim to cut their dependence on China. What are your thoughts on this?
I would agree with that assessment. I think the FTA really would not have been possible. The ECTA would not have seen the light of day had there not been the amount of strategic convergence that we have seen between the two countries in the recent past. And a number of developments have contributed to this strategic proximity. And I think the outbreak of the COVID-19 and the kind of geopolitical alignments and reorganizations that have taken place following the COVID-19 has really brought India and Australia much closer into a space where they realize that there are a large number of common concerns that they have between themselves. And very important among these concerns is the question of how both countries can counterbalance China, can react to China in a large number of spaces, while continuing to work with China. So I think that is a realization and an understanding which both countries have brought on the table. Simultaneously, we have seen, as a result of the United States initiatives in the region, the Indo Pacific has picked up a lot of traction. And the Indo Pacific is an idea since it brings together the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. India as an Indian Ocean power, so as to say, remains an extremely important part of the construct. And we have seen the Indo-Pacific also leading to certain, intra-Indo-Pacific collaborations, like Australia, Japan, and India are working on a supply chain resiliency initiative. And you mentioned the Quad. The Quad, of course, is the centerpiece of the entire Indo-Pacific arrangements that are shaping up right now. But the other point, Ramita, I think, which is important to note is that in the post-COVID sort of landscape, if one can define it that way, what we have seen is a great amount of engagement between what I would typically call the middle powers of the world. And these include countries like India, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Indonesia, Israel, maybe. So there's a lot of talk, conversation, discussion on a large number of mutual concerns, not necessarily all connected to China, but also insofar as mutual global concerns are concerned. Like, say, for example, clean energy, targets that have come out of the COP26, sustainable development, public health. So I think in all these matters, there's a gradual recognition by the global middle powers, all of whom are large economies by themselves, to get formal rules-based frameworks going among themselves. And I think the India-Australia FTA is an example of that. And if we see India's current FTA engagements, this pattern becomes pretty much clear that India is talking to the United Kingdom, India is talking to Canada, India is in talks with the European Union. So there is this larger collective of a global middle power understanding which is coming through in terms of bilateral relationships being worked out. And that, of course, I would say is a product of the changes that we have seen taking place geoeconomically and geopolitically over the last couple of years.
Thank you for sharing your insights, Dr. Palit.
You're welcome, Ramita. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. If you wish to know more about our work at the Institute, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.